Some doors are shut for a reason, and this one the villagers pried open with their own hands. Before dawn, Geralt climbs down into a blighted barrow to take back what was buried beneath it. Chamber by chamber, each layer of the dead older and hungrier than the one above. He has until first light to reach the bottom and seal it properly again. The mound has already begun to close over his head. The blight began at the edge of the barrow field. Geralt saw the first dead furrows before the village roofs came into sight. Long strips of earth gone gray under a sky the color of old iron. Winter wheat stood green on the higher ground. Nearer the mound, the blades had yellowed, curled, sunk back into the soil, as though pressed down by a hand nobody could see. Crows worked the boundary in silence. None crossed it. The barrow rose beyond the fields, broad and low, thick with thorn and coarse grass. It might have passed for a natural hill, but for the stones showing through its sides in dark, even courses. A rowan split by lightning stood at the crown, bare limbs hooked over the mound like fingers that had failed to close. Geralt drew rein beside the first cottage. No dog barked. The animal chained near the door had crawled under a cart and would not look toward the hill. Smoke came weakly from the roof holes, smelling of damp peat and boiled roots. Men watched through shutter cracks, and a woman pulled a child back from the road where she saw the swords above Geralt's shoulder. An old man waited by the well, both hands resting on a blackthorn staff. Sheepskin coat, though the evening was mild. At his neck hung a small iron disc, stamped with a sunburst, the mark polished almost smooth by years of touching. "You came late," the old man said. Geralt told him he had come before dark, and the old man said that was late enough. Geralt dismounted. Roach shifted her weight and blew through her nostrils, head turned away from the mound. The old man noticed and said the horse had sense. Geralt said she disliked bad ground. So do we. A cluster of villagers had gathered at a distance. No one stood between Geralt and the barrow. Even the children kept to the far side of the well, faces pale above patched collars. Geralt looked at the dead furrows again and asked how long. "Since first thaw," the old man said. "One field at first, then another. Roots blackened in the earth. Seed rotted before it opened. Milk soured by sunset. 2 women had lost babes before they quickened. A farmer spat over his shoulder and said it was because the seal was touched. The old man's jaw tightened, because fools mistook old silver for easy coin." Geralt turned toward the speaker. "Who touched it?" Nobody answered at once. At last, a broad-shouldered man stepped out of the crowd, his left hand wrapped in linen to the wrist. Dark stains spread through the weave. His sons had found stones under the north side, he said. Cut marks on them, iron pins driven between. One pin had silver wound round the head. Geralt asked whether they had pulled it. One did. Where was he? The man looked down. The old man struck the rim of the well once with his staff, and the sound carried across the quiet village. Harl died 3 nights after. Couldn't swallow. Said there was soil in his throat. There wasn't. Not when we looked. Geralt faced the barrow. Evening lay along the southern slope, filling the hollows between stones. Wet grass, distant wood smoke, and under both a dry scent like dust, lifted from cloth that had wrapped the dead too long. "Show me the pin." The farmer hesitated, then reached inside his coat and brought out a bundle of sacking. He laid it on the well stones and peeled the cloth back. The iron pin was longer than Geralt's forearm, square in the shaft,
flattened at one end. A thread of tarnished silver wound round its head in 7 tight turns. Most of the metal had gone black, but the silver stayed cold and pale where fingers hadn't touched it, and brown crust filled the markings cut down one side. Geralt bent closer without taking it in hand. The marks were old, older than the village dialect, maybe older than the northern road. No spell in themselves, a burial command. Remain, bind, remember. The last sign had been struck through so hard the chisel split the iron. Where had it been driven? North face, said the old man, under a stone carved like a shut eye. Geralt asked if they had put it back. The farmer's wrapped hand closed. Wouldn't hold. Geralt straightened and asked what came after that. Voices, someone whispered. He looked toward the crowd and found a girl of 15 or 16 beside her mother, clutching the woman's sleeve. From where? He asked. She swallowed. Under the ground. Her mother tried to pull her back. The old man lifted a hand and told her to let the girl speak. The girl kept her eyes on Geralt. At night, when the wind dropped, men talking beneath the fields. Sometimes one, sometimes many. They said names. Whose names? Geralt asked. Ours. The old man touched the iron sun at his throat and said the mound had called his own 3 nights ago. Geralt asked if he had answered. He hadn't? Had anyone? The silence that moved through the villagers said it more clearly than speech would have. Geralt watched their faces until he found the one that couldn't hold still. A thin young man near the back, rubbing his palms against his trousers, eyes on the ground. You, Geralt said. The young man flinched. What had it called him? His brother's voice, he muttered. Dead since winter. And he had answered. His lips trembled. Only said his name. The old man finished it for him, scratching under the floor that night. By morning the boards had bowed upward, and they had moved him into the old man's house. Geralt folded the sacking over the pin. No one sleeps alone. No one walks near the mound after sunset. Block every hearth vent with iron mesh if you have it. Keep lamps burning. A woman gave a low, frightened laugh and said oil cost. Graves cost more. The laugh died. Geralt took the pin from the well, and even through the cloth the cold pressed into his palm. His medallion lay still against his chest, but a dull ache had begun behind his upper teeth. The old warning that came when death magic thickened. He carried the pin to his saddlebags and set it beside a packet of silver filings, then drew out 2 bottles, a coil of cord, a small hammer, a wrapped bundle of beeswax tapers. The old man followed him and said he believed them then. I believe something was bound in that mound. Your people loosened the binding? And the blight? Could be the same thing, Geralt said. Could be what it kept buried. The old man looked out at the dead fields and said there was a cure. Geralt paused with one hand still inside the saddlebag. Of course there is. The old man took the bitterness without protest. His father had told him, and his father's father before that. Lord Vayrod was buried with the summer seed. One of the farmers muttered a prayer. Geralt drew out a stoppered vial and held it up to the last of the daylight. The liquid inside was clear, almost colorless. He asked what summer seed was. A bronze vessel no longer than a hand, the old man said, made like a grain husk, split down the middle. The first seed of every harvest went inside it before sowing. Why bury it? Because Vayrod claimed all harvests were his. He ruled these valleys before there was a village, before the king's road, before the shrine stones. When drought came, he took grain from the poor and fed it to his horses. When the people rose, he hanged their children from the field trees. A gust moved through the grass. The barrow's thorn bushes stirred. The rowan at the crown did not. The old man lowered his voice. A priest named Belisar had led the rising. They bound Vayrod in his hall, dragged him to the mound, and sealed him below while he still breathed. And the summer seed went into the grave with him, so no lord would ever claim it again. Yet you want it back? Their seed died in the ground, the old man said. The old tale had the vessel carrying the blessing of the first fields. Bring it into the sowing furrow, and the earth remembers what it was before Vayrod. Geralt secured the vial in a leather loop. Old tales say many things. This one says more. He waited. The villagers had drawn closer, though none of them crossed the invisible line where the shadow of the well ended. The old man leaned on his staff, knuckles white. Whoever breaks the mound after dusk must leave before dawn, he said. The dead will keep that bargain. If the bearer returns while the east is gray, the barrow opens. If dawn touches the crown first, the hill closes and does not open again. For how long? A generation. Geralt looked at the sun. Its lower edge had nearly touched the forest. Half an hour, perhaps, before dusk came into the field. You could have told me that when I arrived. I wanted you to see the land first. You wanted to see whether I'd ride away? The old man did not deny it. Geralt buckled the silver sword across his back and slid 3 wax tapers into a case at his belt, then added a short pry bar, chalk, a skin of lamp oil, and a clay jar sealed with red wax. Necrophage oil would serve against flesh that still remembered hunger, less so against a true wight. But tombs often held servants before masters, and old lords rarely slept alone. The girl who had heard the voices stepped forward, and her mother caught at her sleeve and missed. Her grandmother had known a song, she said, for the stones. She sang it when thunder came from the mound. Geralt asked what the words were. I only remember one line. Belisar beneath the ash, keep the iron in the flesh. The old man frowned and called it a child's rhyme. Geralt allowed that it might be and crouched by the pin and uncovered the split mark again. Belisar, the priest's name, had not appeared in the burial command, yet the line carried the shape of an instruction. Iron in the flesh. The pin had not merely fixed a stone, it might have pierced something inside the wall. He wrapped it and tied it across his pack and asked whether anyone had opened the mound since Vayrod was buried. No. Whether anyone had entered? The old man's eyes went to the hill, and he said one man had, long ago, before his father's father. He came out before dawn. Geralt asked if he had the vessel. With no tongue. Useful detail. Geralt tightened the strap of his pack. The old man said the man had written one thing before he died, then drew the point of his staff through the dust beside the well. A circle, a line descending through its center, ending in 3 short strokes. Geralt studied the sign. A chamber mark, the old northern kind, cut in tombs and mine shrines. The circle meant a sealed heart. The 3 strokes beneath meant ways below, though whether they marked passages or guardians depended on how the dead had been laid. He wrote it over and over, the old man said, on walls, on doors, on his own arms. The sun slipped behind the trees, and across the field the barrow changed. No stone moved, no earth opened, yet the mound gathered its weight and settled deeper into the land, and the thorn bushes along its flank bent inward, and from somewhere under the turf came a sound too low to be called a voice. A long breath,
drawn through packed soil. The villagers backed away from the well. Geralt took a torch from the farmer who offered it and lit it from a house lamp. Pitch caught with a thick yellow flame. Smoke rolled across his face. "Keep Roach inside a barn," he told them, "and untie her before dawn. And if she tries to leave, let her." The broad-shouldered farmer stared at the wrapped pin fixed to his pack and asked if he was going now. Geralt looked toward the north face of the mound where the shadows had become one unbroken mass. "That is what you paid for." No one followed him beyond the first dead furrow. The ground softened under his boots as he crossed the field. Black water gleamed between the clods, though there had been no rain for days, and each step released the smell of mold and bitter roots. At the edge of the barrow, the air turned colder, and the ache behind his teeth sharpened until the stones themselves might have been grinding together. He found the carved eye beneath a curtain of thorn. The stone stood waist-high and half-buried, its surface cut with a lid closed over a narrow slit, and below it gaped the empty socket where the iron pin had been. The dirt around the hole had crusted dark. Strands of something pale showed deep inside. Geralt set the torch in the ground and drew his knife. He cut the thorn away carefully, exposing 3 more stones, fitted around the first, silver wire laid in their seams, broken in 2 places and pulled outward as though something behind the wall had hooked it with a nail. From within the mound came a faint scrape. It stopped when he stopped. He took the pin from his pack and stripped the cloth away. The iron chilled the air around it. He spread a pinch of silver filings along the shaft and pushed the point into the empty socket, and it met resistance after half its length. Something yielded beyond the stone with a soft, wet sound. The mound shuddered under his hand. Geralt drove the pin with the hammer. Once, dust fell from the carved eye. Twice, and a muffled groan traveled through the hill, deep enough to stir the dead grass around his boots. On the 3rd blow, the pin sank to its silver-wound head. The carved eye opened. Stone grated against stone as the central slab drew inward, revealing a passage no wider than Geralt's shoulders. Air poured out of it, cold and dry, carrying old ash, rust, sealed rot. His torch bent almost flat in the breath of the tomb. Far below, something answered the hammer blows with 3 slow knocks. Geralt lifted the torch, drew his silver sword, and stepped inside. The slab began to close behind him before his 2nd foot had cleared the threshold. It closed with the weight of the hill behind it. Its edge struck the frame and sent a breath of dust across his shoulders. Darkness crowded the torch at once, thick beyond the yellow reach of the flame. He turned, set the silver blade between his knees, and pressed both hands to the stone. It did not shift. The entrance had become a wall again, smooth from within, except for the iron point driven through it at chest height. A pale strand hung from the pin. Geralt raised the torch. Sinew, dried hard and gray, threaded through the stone around the iron as though the wall had grown over it. The pin had passed through a knot of bone and cord concealed inside the masonry. Whatever the old ward had fastened there was still fixed, though the loosened silver had let the passage wake. 3 knocks sounded again from below, spaced like the blows of a patient hammer. Geralt wiped dust from his mouth and moved on. The passage sloped steeply under the mound, its roof so low that the sword hilts above his shoulder scraped the stone. Blocks
pressed close on both sides, fitted without mortar, their faces cut with rows of shallow marks. At first they looked like chisel lines. A few paces farther in he saw fingers, mouths, bent knees, whole bodies reduced to narrow grooves and repeated until they became a border running down into the dark. The flame leaned ahead. No wind touched his face. Geralt slowed. Heat from the torch licked his knuckles, while the cold beyond it deepened, gathering in the hollows of his armor. He tested the floor with the point of the silver sword before each step. The first stones held. The fifth sank under the pressure and released a dry click inside the wall. He froze. Something slid above him. A slab dropped across the passage 2 paces ahead and struck sparks from the floor, its lower edge sharpened like an axe. The weight of it shook grit from the roof and split the torch flame into ragged tongues. Geralt crouched beside the fallen stone. Old brown stains marked the edge, and a braid of hair, thin as spider silk, clung in one notch. The mound had not set the trap for him. It had been waiting since the burial. He found the trigger stone, wedged a piece of broken flint beneath it, and went on. More plates followed, some cracked, others worn smooth by feet that had passed long ago, and at each one the carved bodies on the walls bent lower until the figures no longer knelt but crawled. The slope ended at a narrow landing. Beyond it a stair dropped into blackness. Geralt held the torch over the first step. The shaft descended farther than the light could reach, turning once around a central pillar carved in the likeness of a bound man, rope crossing the stone figure's throat, wrists, chest, and knees. Its face had been chiseled away. Rusted hooks jutted from the pillar at every turn of the stair, each bearing a scrap of leather or a darkened length of cord. At the base, something exhaled. The smell rose slowly. Grave cloth, cold ashes, old meat. Geralt placed one boot on the stair. The stone figure's hands moved. Only a finger's breadth, no more. Dust broke around the carved wrists and drifted down the shaft. Geralt stepped back. The hands remained still. He leaned the torch toward the central pillar and studied the bindings. Not carved from the same stone, those. The ropes had been laid over the figure and hardened with lime, each crossing marked with a nail head of black iron. The faceless man was no effigy. He had been entombed upright inside the pillar, plastered over, used as the heart of the stair. Belisar beneath the ash. Keep the iron in the flesh. Geralt touched the nearest nail with the flat of his blade, and a pulse traveled through the sword, faint but clear, as if steel had met a living heartbeat through stone. The bound priest had not been buried with honor. He had been made part of the prison. A grinding sound came from below, not one movement, several. Geralt took chalk from his belt, drew a small mark beside the landing, and descended. The stair twisted tightly around the pillar, and each turn took him beneath another rusted hook, another remnant of a body once hung there. A child's shoe lay hardened against one step. Farther down, a jawbone had been wedged into a crack, teeth facing inward. The old lord's dead had not been placed around him as mourners. They had been set as warnings. Halfway down, the torchlight reached the floor, and rows of seated figures waited there. Geralt stopped 3 steps above them. The chamber was round and low, its walls lined with stone benches. Men and women sat shoulder to shoulder upon them, perhaps 30 in all, backs straight, hands resting on their knees. Skin had tightened over their faces until cheekbones and teeth showed through. Each corpse wore a narrow strip of tarnished bronze around the brow, and each mouth was packed open with black grain. No mold grew on them, no insects moved. The 3 knocks came once more, and this time Geralt saw their source. At the far side of the chamber, one corpse held a wooden mallet across its lap, its right hand fallen against the stone bench, knuckles resting beside 3 fresh, pale marks. Geralt lowered his weight and listened. Nothing moved. The silence had a strained quality, as if the room were keeping breath it did not need. His eyes followed the floor. A path of flat, white stones crossed between the seated dead and ended at a door bound with bronze. The spaces between the white slabs were filled with ash, and in 3 places bare footprints had disturbed it. Fresh was the wrong word. Nothing here was fresh, yet those prints had edges untouched by dust. He stepped from the stair onto the first white stone. A grain fell from a corpse's mouth and struck the floor with a dry tick. Then another. Geralt raised his sword, and the corpse nearest him tilted its head. Black kernels spilled over its lower lip and pattered onto its chest. Its eyes opened beneath lids like old parchment, no gleam in them, only hollows packed with soot. Along the benches, mouths began to empty. The grain ran in thin streams, filling the chamber with a sound like rain on dead leaves. One by one, the seated figures turned their faces toward Geralt. He did not move. Their binding lay in the grain. He could smell it now beneath the rot, a bitter scent of burned rye and blood. Each body had been made to swallow, part of the same offering, joining them to one command. Strike one down, and the rest would rise. Burn them where they sat, and the chamber would fill with smoke before the spell failed. The corpse with the mallet lifted its hand. Geralt cast Axii before the fingers closed around the handle. The sign flared pale in the air, its force passing over the first corpse and catching the line behind it, rippling from brow to brow along the bronze bands. Heads jerked sideways. Several bodies sagged against the wall, but the mallet-bearer only trembled and continued to rise. Axii had reached their minds. There were none left to command. Geralt backed onto the stair as the first corpse stepped from the bench, legs bending poorly, dried sinews crackling beneath the skin. Another followed, then 3 more, their feet dragging black grain into the ash. They did not rush. They came together, closing the chamber by weight and number. The nearest corpse raised both hands. Geralt struck its wrist aside with a silver blade and cut through the neck. The head fell. The body remained standing, hands clawing at him blindly, while the dead beside it pressed forward. He drove his boot into its chest and sent it back into the others. Bones broke with dull snaps. The line folded for a heartbeat, enough for Geralt to leap from the stair onto the white path. Cold fingers closed around the edge of his cloak. He spun, cut low, severed 2 hands at the knuckles. The bodies did not cry out. They crowded after him, mouths open, grain still pouring, as though each skull held a field. Geralt reached the center of the chamber and saw the pattern. Every trail of fallen grain bent toward the central pillar. The ash around its base had darkened with grease, and thin channels ran from beneath the benches to a shallow ring cut into the floor, joining at the priest's stone-bound feet. The dead were not merely sharing one command. They were feeding it through Belisar's body, forcing the man who had sealed Vayrod to guard the way down. The first corpse reached him.
Geralt ducked beneath its arms, caught the bronze strip around its brow with the sword point, tore it free. The corpse dropped at once, knees to stone, spine folding, the remains collapsing into a heap of cloth and bone. A second seized his shoulder, teeth closing against the leather guard at his neck. Geralt smashed the pommel into its temple and pulled the bronze band loose with his free hand. The metal burned his palm. The body fell against him suddenly heavy, nearly dragging him down with it. More closed around him, he cast Ard into the floor. The blast struck the ash ring rather than the dead. Dust and black grain erupted through the chamber in a choking cloud, and the force tore open the shallow channels, scattering the offering away from the pillar, breaking the lines that joined the benches to the bound priest. Every corpse stopped. For one breath they stood crooked in the drifting ash. Then the bronze bands split. Thin cracks raced through the metal. The strips sprang from dead brows and clattered across the floor, and bodies fell where they stood, one after another, striking stone benches, white path, and each other until the chamber filled with the rolling sound of loose bones. Geralt remained crouched amid them, sword raised. The torch had fallen near the stair, its flame guttering in the ash, but holding. From inside the central pillar came a slow scrape. The faceless stone head turned toward him. A fissure opened where the mouth had been sealed, dust sifting from it, and after the dust a whisper so dry the words were shaped from sand. Below, Geralt picked up the torch. The crack widened. Below, the voice said again, and the pillar's stone fingers curled against their bindings. He waits below. Geralt stepped close enough to see a dark eye through the broken plaster and asked whether the thing inside was Belisar. The eye shifted toward the bronze-bound door. Name taken, it breathed. Tongue taken. Dawn taken. The iron nails trembled in the hardened ropes. Geralt looked at the scattered black grain, then at the crack in the priest's face, and asked who had struck the name away. The eye closed. Far beneath the chamber, a chain dragged across stone. The pillar shuddered from base to crown, and several nails worked outward by the breadth of a fingernail, pushed from within by fingers that had been dead for centuries. "Do not free me," Belisar whispered. Geralt turned toward the bronze-bound door. Behind him the priest began to weep ash. The bronze-bound door had no handle. 3 bands crossed it from jamb to jamb, green with age except where old fingers had worn the metal smooth. Between them the wood had blackened to the hardness of stone. A shallow bowl had been cut into the floor before the threshold, and in it lay the charred husks of grain, finger bones, and one narrow strip of skin bearing letters burned into the flesh. Geralt set the torch into a crack in the wall and crouched. The letters were nearly gone. He turned the strip with the tip of his knife, bringing the least damaged edge toward the flame. Rhysar. The beginning had been cut away. Behind him, ash sifted from the pillar in thin gray streams. Belisar's eye stayed shut inside the fissure. His bound hands strained once beneath the plaster, then stilled, as though that small movement had spent whatever force was left in him. Geralt looked from the flesh strip to the iron nails, a name taken, tongue taken. The dead below hadn't erased the priest from memory. They had divided him. Name from flesh, voice from mouth, body from grave, and each piece put to work holding another lock. He slid the strip into a leather pouch. The bronze door creaked. Low. Geralt rose and pulled the torch free.
Nothing had touched the wood, yet the middle band had tightened until the nails groaned in their sockets. A line of pale moisture appeared along the threshold and spread across the floor toward his boots. He stepped back. The liquid was clear and without smell. Where it touched a fallen grain husk, the black shell softened, swelled, opened, and a white root pushed out of it and twisted blindly across the stone. More water seeped under the door. The roots multiplied. They crawled through the ash, thin as worms at first, thickening as they fed on what was left of the burial offering. One reached a severed hand and slipped between the finger bones, and the dead flesh tightened around it. Geralt snatched the torch away as roots curled toward the heat. The chamber floor began to whisper, thousands of small white threads dragging over stone, searching for grain, bone, leather, warmth. They gathered around the fallen corpses and went in through mouths and eye sockets. Ribs shifted, spines bent upward beneath torn burial cloth. Belisar's eye opened again. "Firewake seed," he rasped. Geralt looked at the torch. The roots nearest it had grown thickest. He smothered the flame against the wall, and the darkness closed over the chamber and the roots stopped. For several breaths, there was only his own breathing and the faint crackle of cooling pitch. Then the white growth moved again, slower, guided by the scrape of his boots and the heat of his body. He found a wax taper in his belt pouch by touch. Lighting it would feed the thing. Moving blind would leave him among the risen dead. A corpse shifted near his left knee. Geralt struck with the silver sword, cutting through cloth and root together. The blade met no resistance until it touched the white strand. Then the growth clenched on the edge with sudden strength, trying to drag the sword down into the ribs. He twisted free and stepped onto the white path. The roots recoiled from silver. He drew the small packet of filings from his belt and scattered a narrow arc in front of him. The roots touched it and writhed back, folding over one another without a sound. He widened the arc toward the bronze door, laying a pale road through the dark. Behind him, bones scraped upright. He heard jaws opening, tendons drawn taut by roots that had found purchase inside the corpses. One body fell off a bench and landed on all fours. Another knocked against the pillar. Belisar made no sound, though the stone around him cracked under the impact. Geralt moved toward the door, measuring each step by the glimmer of silver at his feet. The darkness hid the dead until their bones brushed his cloak. A hand closed on his upper arm. He drove his elbow back, felt ribs collapse, tore free as roots snapped under the cloth. The bronze bands trembled. They were not fastening the door from his side. Their nails pointed outward. Something behind the wood had been pulling them inward for centuries. He found the lowest band with his fingers and traced it to the jamb. The bronze had been stamped with tiny ears of grain. Every one of them bent toward the threshold bowl, and at the center lay a shallow hollow the size of a thumbprint. A blood seal. He cut his palm with the knife and pressed it to the hollow. The bronze warmed at once. The door inhaled. Air rushed through the seams, pulling ash and grain husks and white roots toward it. The growth on the floor stretched tight. Root-filled corpses slid across the chamber, nails scratching stone as the draft dragged them to the threshold. Geralt held his hand against the band. Blood ran into the stamped grain. One ear darkened, then another. When the mark had traveled halfway across the door, the metal stopped drinking. The seal wanted more than blood. Behind him, the dead closed in. He felt them through the floor before they reached him,
uneven impacts traveling under his boots. He turned and cast Igni low, a brief sheet of flame across the silver filings rather than into the roots themselves. The filings flashed white. For an instant the chamber stood revealed. Corpses bent under masses of pale growth, jaws stretched wide, hands knotted together by roots. The silver fire ran along the arc and scorched every strand crossing it. The growth shrank back with a sound like air sucked through teeth. Then the light died, and Geralt faced the door again. Belisar's broken whisper crossed the darkness. His blood. Geralt looked at the bowl. The finger bones were common. The charred grain belonged to the binding. The strip of skin carried the priest's divided name. None of it came from Veyrod. He searched the threshold with his knife point, probing the cracks under the bronze until the blade caught on something set into the wood. He worked it loose and drew out a blackened tooth, long-rooted, capped in tarnished gold. A lord's tooth. He pressed it into the hollow. The middle band snapped open so violently that one end struck the wall. The upper band followed, curling away from the door like a cut strap. The lowest held. The roots surged across the scorched silver behind him. A corpse hit Geralt in the back and drove him against the wood, fingers clawing beneath his armor. He dropped the spent torch, caught the dead thing's wrist and pulled it over his shoulder. It struck the door face first. White roots burst through its cheek and spread across the bronze, feeling for the blood seal. The lowest band began to darken. Veyrod's tooth had woken it. Geralt's blood fed it. The root-bound corpse joined the two. The door opened a hand's breadth, and cold water flooded through the gap. It struck his boots and spread over the chamber floor, black in the darkness, bitter with iron. The roots convulsed. Those touching the water swelled until their skins split and spilled clear sap. Corpses toppled as the binding softened inside them. Geralt wrenched the door wider. The pressure behind it threw him backward. Water burst into the chamber at knee height, carrying splinters of burial wood and clots of gray mud. It rolled over the dead, tore roots off bone, filled the ash channels around Belisar's pillar. The priest gasped as if the flood had reached living lungs. Geralt seized the door edge and forced himself through. The passage beyond sloped sharply down. Water rushed round his legs, dragging at his boots, pulling him into the dark. He caught a bronze ring set in the wall and held on while the chamber behind him filled. Something heavy struck the far side of the door. Once. The remaining band bent inward. He drew the wax taper, shielded it behind his body, and struck flint. The wick caught with a small, steady flame. The passage was built of red stone. Water streamed down between the blocks and gathered in carved channels along the floor. Faces had been cut into the walls, at ankle height, each with its mouth open to drink the flow, their eyes inlaid with black glass. As the water rose, the eyes followed him down the slope. The door behind him slammed shut. The sound rolled through the passage and faded below. Geralt lifted the taper. A narrow stair descended into water. At the edge of the light stood a woman in a rotted burial shift, her back turned to him, wet hair hanging to her waist. Her bare feet rested several steps beneath the surface, though the water rose only to Geralt's ankles, where he stood. She was too tall. Her shoulders nearly touched the ceiling. One arm hung at her side, fingers trailing in the current, the nails dark and long enough to scratch the stone as the water drew them back and forth. Geralt did not move. The woman raised her head. A child's voice came from beneath her hair. Geralt. The name went through the stair shaft in a whisper, and the water around his boots tightened like a hand. He lowered the taper until its light struck the surface. No reflection stood beneath the woman. Only a long shape moved in the water, pale and narrow, coiled around the submerged stairs. The burial shift was bait. Geralt stepped onto the first stair, and the pale shape uncoiled. Water climbed the walls in one smooth sheet as the thing below rose toward him, and the woman's body folded backward at the waist, opening where a spine should have been, a mass of blind faces turning beneath the cloth. He threw the taper past it. The flame arced into the lower dark, and every face turned toward the falling light. He went the other way, diving beneath the water as the grave thing lunged upward. Cold closed over his head. The current seized his cloak and dragged him down the steps, and when Geralt opened his eyes, he saw a red blur of stone and white limbs. The creature had no single body beneath the shift, only a knot of drowned, dead-bound mouth to ankle, their arms woven together around a long cord of black hair. The falling taper touched the water and vanished. In the darkness, the thing came after his warmth. Geralt drew the knife from his boot and cut his cloak free. The heavy cloth billowed away in the current, and the grave thing seized it at once, faces biting into empty wool, while he pulled himself deeper along the stair rail. His chest tightened. The water grew colder with every step. Ahead, a faint green glow marked the bottom of the shaft. Geralt kicked toward it as the creature released the cloak and twisted after him. Fingers brushed his boot. He reached the last stair, found a stone lip, and hauled himself through an opening barely wide enough for his shoulders. The grave thing struck the gap behind him. Too many bodies tried to pass together. Bones jammed against the stone, and blind mouths snapped in the water inches from his heel. Geralt rolled into a flooded chamber and came up beneath a ceiling so low his head struck rock. He gasped once, quietly. Green light shone from fungus growing across a row of half-submerged coffins. Behind him, the grave thing began pulling itself apart to fit through the opening. The first arm came through alone. Its hand struck the flooded floor, fingers spreading in the green light, and dragged a shoulder after it. Bone scraped stone. The thing had begun undoing itself in the stair shaft, breaking the knot of bodies apart so each piece could crawl through and join again on the other side. Geralt backed between the coffins. Water reached his waist. The ceiling hung less than a hand above his head and forced him to stoop as he moved. Coffin lids stood open along both walls, their inner surfaces furred with pale fungus. Some held skeletons wrapped in reed matting. Others were empty except for shallow pools where black shapes clung to the wood. He breathed through his nose and tasted iron. The opening behind him cracked. A second arm emerged. Then a child's head with its jaw hanging loose, black hair pouring around it and moving against the current. The face turned toward Geralt, though the eyes had been sewn closed. He sheathed the silver sword. There was no room to swing it here. A hand reached from the nearest coffin and closed around his wrist. Geralt drove his knife through the palm into the wood beneath, and the fingers tightened once, then released. He looked down. The body inside the coffin had not moved. Its arm lay across its chest beneath the reeds. The hand pinned under his knife had grown from the lid. More shapes stirred in the green growth. Small fingers pressed outward through the fungus, followed by teeth and the ridges of half-formed faces. The light itself was alive, feeding on the dead wood and wearing whatever shapes had been buried near it. Geralt tore his knife free, and the hand dissolved into wet threads. Behind him, the grave thing forced a rib cage through the narrow gap. It came apart with the pressure, bones springing loose and floating into the chamber. Black hair followed, winding around each piece and drawing them together in the water. He needed depth. The chamber sloped away beyond the coffins, but the green light weakened there. Geralt felt along the wall as he moved and found carved lines beneath the slime, running at shoulder height, too regular to be cracks. He wiped one clean with his palm. 3 boats had been cut into the red stone. In the first, men lay bound beneath a standing lord. In the second, they were cast into water. The third showed the lord alone, holding a stalk of grain while hands rose around him from below. This was no burial pool. It had been a drowning chamber, and the coffins were not for the honored dead. They were weights. A crack sounded at the opening. The grave thing's first body tore free of the stair and dropped into the water. A woman from the waist upward and 3 different men below, their torsos bound end to end by hair, drawn through their ribs. The burial shift had split open, faces turned within its back, mouths opening soundlessly as water poured from them. Geralt pressed forward into the dark, and the floor vanished beneath his next step. He caught the edge with both hands as his body dropped. Cold water closed to his shoulders. Below him the chamber sank into a shaft, where the green glow faded to black. The grave thing splashed between the coffins. Geralt lowered 1 foot, searching. His boot found a narrow ledge cut along the shaft wall. He eased onto it and felt the current pull downward past his knees. Something was draining the chamber from below. He drew a vial from his belt and bit out the stopper. The potion smelled of salt, crushed pearl, and bitter herbs. He swallowed half. Cold spread down his throat and opened his lungs with a sharp ache. Killer whale would not give him endless breath. Nothing did. It would buy him time enough to find what the water hid. The grave thing entered the dark behind him. Geralt slipped beneath the surface. The shaft narrowed after several body lengths, then opened into a larger space below. Green light from the fungus thinned above him, revealing only drifting bones and the pale cords of roots hanging from the roof. The current drew him toward a stone grate set into the floor. Bodies covered it. Dozens had been chained, face down over the iron bars. Their backs split where roots grew through the ribs and into the stone beneath. Each corpse wore a bronze loop around the neck, and the loops were linked by one long chain that disappeared into a hole at the center of the grate. A ward made from the drowned. The grave thing followed him down. It moved faster in the deep water, the many bodies folding and opening like a net cast by unseen hands. Black hair spread before it, feeling through the dark. Geralt watched it touch one floating bone, circle it, and move on. The thing was not tracking sight. He reached for the clay jar sealed with red wax. Necrophage oil would not help against what had no single flesh, but the base carried celandine, dog tallow, and powdered silver. Enough silver to foul the hair that bound it. Geralt broke the jar against the grate. Oil bloomed through the water in slow golden clouds, and the grave thing entered it. Black hair recoiled at once. The strands knotted around the bodies, tightening so hard that ribs collapsed inward. Mouths opened across the creature's length. The drowned dead thrashed against one another, trying to retreat through water that gave them no purchase. Geralt seized the chain at the grate. The bronze loops around the corpses stirred, and heads lifted from the iron bars one after another, empty eye sockets turning toward him. These dead were bound to the ward, yet unlike the thing above them, each remained itself. They had not been woven together. Their separate deaths were the lock. The chain ran through every collar and vanished below. Geralt tested it. Something pulled back. He braced both boots against the grate and hauled. The drowned bodies rose with the chain, necks bending at sharp angles. Bronze groaned. At the center of the grate, a black iron hook emerged from the hole, followed by a knot of cloth wrapped around something long and pale. A tongue pierced through with the hook and sunk beneath the drowned. Belisar's tongue. The grave thing twisted free of the silvered oil. A hand closed around Geralt's ankle. He kicked, struck a face, and felt teeth scrape across the leather of his boot. More arms reached for him. The creature had begun dividing again, sending separate bodies through the oil while the hair remained behind. Geralt pulled the hook from the grate. Every drowned corpse moved. The ward let go with one deep shudder. Bronze loops snapped open. Bodies lifted off the bars into the current and drifted upward between Geralt and the grave thing. And for a moment the chamber was full of the dead. The creature came through them, gathering as it came. Each corpse it touched vanished into the woven mass, drawn tight by black hair. It swelled, taking its old victims back into the shape that had been made from them. Geralt wrapped the pierced tongue round his wrist, drew his knife, and cut the chain where it passed through the hook. The grate opened beneath him. Downward water seized everything. The iron bars folded apart like fingers, and he was dragged through with the chain. The freed corpses, the grave thing collapsing after him. Stones struck his shoulder. His knife went out of his hand, and he fell through black water. The current hurled him along a narrow channel, turning him against walls he could not see. The potion kept his lungs from closing, though pressure tightened behind his eyes. He covered his face with one arm and held the hook to his chest with the other. Hair brushed his heel. The grave thing had survived the fall. Geralt twisted in the current and looked back. It no longer wore the shape of a woman. The water had stretched it into a long procession of drowned bodies linked mouth to ankle, each drawn forward by the black cord of hair, and its blind faces snapped at his boots. Ahead, the channel ended in a square of darker stone. No opening showed there. Geralt reached for Ard. The sign struck poorly underwater, blunted and spread, but the old wall had been built to hold pressure from the other side. The stones jumped in their beds. Silt burst from the seams. The grave thing caught his left boot. He kicked and felt the leather tear, and then cold fingers closed round his calf. He cast Ard again. Pain lanced through his forearm. The current shuddered around him, and one stone cracked across the middle but held. The fingers climbed toward his knee. Geralt drew the silver sword. There was scarcely room, but he did not need a cut. He drove the pommel into the cracked stone. Once. The blade rang against the channel wall. Twice. A black line opened through the fracture. On the third blow, the stone burst outward, and the water carried him through. He struck a sloping floor, rolled, came up coughing in air so cold it hurt. Water poured around him into a wide chamber, then vanished through grooves cut along the walls. The grave thing hit the broken opening behind him, and its bodies jammed in the breach. Geralt got to his feet and pulled the silver blade free. The thing clawed through, hair spilling over the floor like ink, several faces opening along its length. He looked down at the hook in his hand. Belisar's tongue was still wrapped around the iron, shriveled and black, the root severed cleanly, and along its underside small marks had been burned into the flesh, the missing beginning of the priest's name. Geralt held the tongue above the silver blade. Belisar. The grave thing stopped. Every face turned toward the hook. The hair binding them tightened, then loosened. He said the name again, slower, giving each sound the weight of the marks burned into the flesh. Belisar. The thing recoiled from the breach, and its bodies began to separate. One by one, the drowned slipped free of the black hair and sank into the shallow water, no longer clawing, no longer biting. A child fell first, then the woman from the burial shift, then men with chains still fixed round their wrists. The hair writhed alone among them, searching for a voice that no longer held it. Geralt touched the silver blade to the tongue. The dried flesh curled round the metal. A sound passed through the chamber, low and broken, as though a man far above had drawn breath after centuries without lungs. The black hair went still. Geralt lowered the hook. Behind him, past the reach of the fading green light, stood a row of stone pillars, with names covering them from floor to roof. Some had been carved deeply and filled with bronze. Others were little more than scratches made by fingernails. At the center of the chamber, a single pillar had been hacked smooth. From somewhere beyond it came the slow drag of a chain. Closer this time, it dragged once across stone, then stopped. Geralt stood among the drowned while water ran from his armor and gathered in the grooves beneath the pillars. The green glow behind him had almost failed. What remained clung to coffin wood and wet bone, leaving the chamber ahead, in a dimness where the names shifted whenever he breathed. He took out another wax taper. The first spark died against the damp wick. The second caught, drawing a flame no bigger than a fingernail. He cupped it until it steadied, then raised it toward the nearest pillar. Names covered every face of the stone. Some had been cut with care, each letter deep and square. Others crowded into the spaces between, scratched by knives, nails, broken teeth. Men, women, children, servants, field hands, captives, taken in wars, too small for any chronicle. Beneath many of them ran the same 3 marks the old man had drawn beside the well. A sealed heart and 3 ways below. Geralt passed between them. The chamber narrowed towards the smooth pillar at its center. Chips of stone lay round its base, pale against the red floor. Someone had hacked at it after the other names were carved, striking until every mark was gone, then polished the wounds with sand until the surface came up blank. He held the taper close. No letters remained, but shallow pits dotted the stone where the chisel had bitten deepest. Geralt followed their pattern with one finger. They formed no name he could read. They had been destroyed too thoroughly. The dried tongue tightened around the iron hook in his other hand. A tremor passed through the flesh. Geralt looked down. The burned letters on its underside had darkened in the taper light, and when he turned the hook toward the blank pillar, the tongue curled, as though trying to touch the stone. "Your name was here," Geralt said. The chamber answered with a faint exhalation. Dust slid from the smooth face. Behind the pillar, 3 passages opened, each narrow and arched, cut to the same height and width, each descending by 7 steps before bending out of sight. Above the first had been carved a sheaf of grain. Above the second, a closed eye.
The third bore only a deep vertical cut like a wound made by an axe. The sealed heart and 3 ways below. Geralt moved to the first passage. Warm air rose from it with the smell of summer fields, too strong, thick with crushed stalks and sun-heated earth. Beneath it lay sweetness, almost honey, and the faint copper tang of fresh blood. He lowered the taper toward the steps. Golden dust covered them, each grain shining as though lit from within. Geralt touched one with the tip of his silver sword. The dust clung to the blade and spread against the metal in branching veins. He wiped it off on the stone. The second passage breathed cold. Its steps were dry and clean, no dust on them, no cobweb across the arch. Far below, a blue light appeared and vanished at steady intervals, as if someone were carrying a lantern through chambers beyond the bend. Geralt listened. A woman was humming there. The tune held no words, but he knew its shape. The sort sung beside a hearth while winter pressed at the shutters. The voice shifted as he listened, becoming lower, rougher, then young again. It was searching for one he might follow. He turned from it. The third passage gave nothing. No air moved there. The taper flame leaned away from the opening, though the chamber stayed still. The vertical cut above the arch was filled with black wax, and at its base lay one broken link of iron chain. Geralt crouched and examined it. The link had been split from within. Rust covered the outer curve, but the break itself was bright. Something had passed this way recently. The dragging sound came again, deeper now, beyond the third passage. Geralt straightened. A voice spoke from the first arch. "Witcher." The word came from far below, but the chamber shaped it clearly. He looked toward the grain-marked passage. A figure stood on the 4th step, the old man from the village leaning on his blackthorn staff, sheepskin coat hanging wet round his legs. His face was gray with fear. Blood ran from one ear. "You took too long," he said. "It called us out." Geralt kept the sword where it was. "You stayed behind the dead furrow." "We did." Then the ground opened beneath the houses. The old man came down 1 step, golden dust turning around his boots, without settling on them. Geralt watched the staff. At the old man's throat, the iron sunburst hung motionless, its polished face throwing back no taper flame. Geralt asked his name. The figure's mouth tightened, and it told him he already knew it. He said he had never been told. For a moment the old man stayed still. Then his skin split from brow to chin. The face opened without blood, peeling apart like damp cloth, and beneath it lay another face, younger than another beneath that, each stretched over the next. Farmer, soldier, child, woman, all of them looking through the same empty eyes. The thing came up the steps. Geralt threw the taper into the passage, and flame touched the golden dust, and the stair erupted. Fire ran downward in a bright sheet, consuming grain, faces, and false summer scent. The creature folded inward as the heat took it, every stolen mouth opening at once. No cry emerged. Its body collapsed into a column of black husks that poured down the steps and vanished around the bend. The blast rolled through the chamber and struck the pillars, and the names began to whisper. Hundreds of voices rose from the carved stone, each speaking itself. Some pleaded, some cursed. Others repeated one word until it lost all shape. The sound crowded the low roof, pressed against Geralt's ears, and entered through the bones of his jaw. The second passage brightened. Blue light climbed the steps, and the humming woman appeared at the bend in a white shift, carrying a lamp made from a human skull. Her hair covered her face. As she rose, shadows followed on the wall behind her. Many more than one body could cast. Geralt gripped the tongue hook. "Belishar," he said. The whispering names faltered. The woman stopped. Geralt spoke the priest's name again and held the tongue toward the blank pillar, and the dried flesh strained so hard against the hook that it tore along one edge. A drop of black fluid struck the floor. Letters appeared on the stone. They came slowly, dark lines seeping through the smooth surface as though written from within. Belisar.
The blue light went out. The woman on the steps bent backward. Her skull lamp fell and shattered, and the shadows behind her fled down the passage, flattening against the walls before darkness swallowed them. Across the chamber, every carved name fell silent. The blank pillar cracked. A line opened from its crown to the floor, and within the split lay no stone, only packed ash and the curve of a human spine. The name had been carved upon Belisar's grave because the pillar was his grave. Whoever erased it had severed his command from the chamber and left his body to hold the ways below without authority over them. The iron hook warmed in Geralt's hand. From the fissure came the priest's voice, clearer than before. Third, Geralt turned toward the passage marked by the axe wound and asked what waited there. "Truth," the voice said, scraping up through dried lungs. He asked what guarded it. The pillar shuddered before it answered, "Regret." Geralt's mouth tightened. "That was not a creature," he said. "It learned." The chain dragged again, and this time the sound came from the passage mouth itself. A figure entered the taperless gloom beyond the third arch. It was too tall for the corridor, yet it moved without stooping. Armor covered it from throat to heel, plates layered and sewn together with black cord. Rust had swollen the joints until they resembled knots in old wood. A closed helm hid the face. Across its shoulders lay a length of chain, thick as a man's wrist, each link dark with burial pitch. The guardian did not step into the chamber. It stood beyond the arch and watched. Geralt felt its attention through the visor slit. Cold gathered around the silver sword in his hand. The old ache returned behind his teeth, sharper now, and with it a pressure in his chest, like deep water. The corpse knight lifted one gauntleted hand. 3 fingers remained. It pointed at the hook, and Belisar's tongue twisted around the iron. The guardian lowered its arm and drew one end of the chain from its shoulder. At the last link hung a collar, broad enough to close around a man's neck, the inner rim covered in deep scratches. The chain that had dragged Vayrod alive into the mound. Geralt understood then what stood before him. The guardian had not served the Lord in life. It had helped bury him. Priest, jailer, executioner, perhaps all 3. Afterward, Vayrod had taken it in death and turned the hand that chained him into the hand that kept others away, knowing its nature would not free it, knowing the chain might. Geralt lowered the silver sword by an inch, and the corpse knight moved. The chain came through the arch with a hiss of iron over stone. Geralt leapt aside as the collar struck the smooth pillar, and the impact split Belisar's grave from crown to base. Ash burst into the chamber. The priest's spine toppled from the broken stone, still bound in hardened ropes, and iron nails scattered across the floor. The dried tongue tore free of Geralt's hook and flew toward the falling remains. For one instant, it hung in the ash. Then it struck the jawbone inside the split pillar. Belisar screamed. The sound shook dust from every name. Stone groaned overhead. The first passage spat a cloud of burning grain. into the chamber, while from the second came the blue light again, now multiplied into a procession of skull lamps. The barrow had heard its priest recover his voice, and everything below answered. Geralt caught the corpse knight's chain before it could recoil. Iron burned through his glove. He wrapped it once around his forearm, planted both boots against the floor, and pulled. The guardian lurched into the arch. Rust cracked from its knees. Geralt pulled again, not trying to bring it down, only turning the collar toward the broken pillar. The guardian resisted with the weight of stone, but the chain itself strained toward Belisar's remains. It remembered its first purpose, even if the dead hand did not. The collar swung. Belisar's bones rose within the ash, ropes tightening around the skeleton, the tongue moving in the broken jaw. Empty sockets turned toward the corpse knight. "Valor," the priest said. The guardian stopped. The name passed through its armor like a blade. Its helm tilted. Belisar lifted one bound hand and pointed down the third passage and told it to hold him. The corpse knight shuddered. For a breath, the chain slackened in Geralt's grip. Then something far below pulled on the other end. Valor's body snapped backward. The chain tore through Geralt's hand, ripping leather and skin, and he released it before it took his arm with it. The guardian vanished down the third passage, dragged into darkness by the lord it had once bound. Belisar's bones collapsed. "Go," the priest whispered. Geralt stepped over the broken pillar and entered the third way. Behind him, the names began shouting again. The passage descended steeply, each step worn hollow in the middle. Black wax ran from the walls in slow threads. Far below, iron struck stone, followed by the grinding struggle of the guardian against the chain. Geralt drew a fresh breath and went down toward it. The stair narrowed until he had to turn his shoulders. Black wax streaked the walls on either side, soft beneath his gloves despite the cold. It gathered in the hollows of the steps and clung to his soles, pulling at each footfall with a wet reluctance. The air below carried no rot now. It smelled of roots cut open in deep soil, of iron left under rain, and of the bitter draught that rose from a grave when the lid first shifted. Valor's chain scraped somewhere beneath him. The sound came in broken surges. Iron dragged, stopped, then struck the walls hard enough to jar the stair. Between each movement lay a silence filled by another noise, slower and deeper, a dull beat passing through the mound, as though the hill had grown a heart far below the earth. Geralt descended with his silver sword close to his body. His wounded palm had begun to stiffen. Blood darkened the torn glove and made the hilt slick. The killer wail still sharpened his breath, but its cold strength was fading, leaving heaviness in his chest and a sour taste beneath his tongue. He measured the remaining distance by the pressure in his ears and the growing heat of the black wax. At the next turn, the stair opened above a shaft. A bridge of 3 stone slabs crossed it, no rail, no support. On either side the dark fell away, too deep for the faint glow rising from below to find a floor. Roots hung across the gulf in thick ropes, pale where they had pushed through the masonry, black where burial pitch had soaked in. Several had wound around the bridge and split the outer slabs end to end. Valor stood on the middle stone. The corpse knight faced away from Geralt, feet braced wide, both hands locked around the chain that ran from the collar across the bridge and down into an opening on the far side. Each pull from below bowed him toward the shaft. Rusted plates groaned over the dead bones inside. The guardian held. Beyond him waited a low arch sealed with roots. Geralt stepped onto the first slab and the helm turned. There were no eyes in the visor slit, only a thread of gray vapor that passed through it whenever the armor moved. The chain tightened. The corpse knight lowered one shoulder and set itself between Geralt and the rooted arch. Belisar named you, Geralt said. Valor did not move. You dragged Vayrad here. Iron fingers tightened around the links. The deep beat traveled through the bridge. Roots stirred along the shaft walls, drawing themselves out of cracks with the slow flexing of buried limbs. Geralt advanced a step and Valor let go of the chain with one hand. The free gauntlet closed on a sword hilt fused into its scabbard by rust. Metal tore as the blade came free. Broad, dark, broken a hand's length from the point. No edge remained, only burial corrosion and notches deep enough to hold old fibers. The knight raised it and Geralt kept his own blade low. That sword did not kill him. Valor struck. The broken weapon came across the bridge with crushing weight. Geralt caught it near the hilt and turned it aside, silver shrieking over rust, and the force drove him against the left wall of roots. They tightened at the touch of warmth, curling around his shoulder before he cut free. Valor did not follow. It returned its hand to the chain as another pull came from below. The guardian's knees bent. Stone cracked beneath one heel. Geralt saw the struggle then. Vayrad was drawing the chain toward the deepest chamber, and Valor could neither release it nor give up the way. The dead knight was still the jailer. The Lord had made that duty into a leash. A second pull shook the bridge. The rear slab shifted under Geralt's boot, and chips fell into the shaft, striking nothing he could hear. Valor raised the broken sword again. Geralt sheathed his silver blade. The corpse knight paused. He drew steel. The dark iron sword had belonged to a living man and had buried one. Whatever clung to Valor was grave magic, but the armor and the weapon were relics of his flesh, bound more tightly to memory than to undeath. Silver would wound the white. Steel might reach the jailer beneath it. Valor came forward. Geralt met the broken blade with steel and let the force drive both swords down, stepped inside the knight's reach, seized the chain near its breastplate, and twisted it around the rusted weapon. Iron link caught jagged edge. Valor pulled back, wrenching the sword free of Geralt's guard, but the chain stayed looped across it. The next tug came from the chamber. Valor's own weapon was torn from its hand. It flew across the bridge, struck the rooted arch, and vanished through a gap into the dark beyond, and the corpse knight lurched after it, dragged by the chain tangled around the blade. Geralt caught the collar. The iron was wide and heavy, scored on the inner rim by a living man's nails. He forced it against the stone and saw the hinge under the pitch, a small bronze pin holding the clasp, green with age, stamped with the same closed eye mark as the first door. Valor turned on him. One gauntlet closed around Geralt's throat and lifted him from the bridge. His boot struck the slab, then lost it. Roots brushed his back above the shaft. The fingers tightened, pressing leather and mail into his windpipe while the chain jerked them both toward the arch. Geralt drove his thumb against the bronze pin.
It did not move. Valor's helm came close. Through the visor lay only darkness and a strip of something pale pulled tight across the opening. Skin preserved beneath the iron with letters cut into it. Fae. The rest of the name had been carved on the flesh inside the helm. Geralt stopped fighting the hand at his throat. he reached between the plates at Valor's neck and pressed his bleeding palm against the hidden skin. "Valor," he forced out. The grip loosened. The corpse knight shook as if struck from within. Its gauntlet opened, and Geralt dropped onto the bridge. He landed on one knee, breath tearing through his throat. "Valor," he said again. The guardian turned towards the chain. For the first time it looked down at its own hands. Geralt struck the bronze pin with the pommel of his steel sword. The pin snapped. The collar opened. A force like a released bowstring tore through the bridge. The chain whipped from Valor's grasp and flew into the rooted arch, link after link vanishing into the chamber beyond, its last coils striking sparks from the stone before it disappeared with a crash that rolled down through the mound. Valor remained standing. The deep beat stopped. For one breath, nothing moved. Then the corpse knight stepped aside. Geralt passed him and cut through the roots, sealing the arch. Thick sap bled from them, dark as old wine. They drew back from his steel and opened a space barely large enough to enter. Valor spoke behind him, the voice coming through the closed helm as a scrape of iron over bone. "Take his summer." Geralt looked back. The guardian had turned toward the shaft, gray vapor streaming from the visor, thinner now. "And you?" Valor rested both hands on the pommel of the broken sword that was no longer there, remembering the stance after the weapon had gone. Hold his winter. The roots closed between them, and Geralt entered the deepest chamber. It was round and wider than the mound should have allowed, the walls hidden beneath roots that came down from the roof in great tangled columns. Some were no thicker than veins. Others were broad as tree trunks and had grown around stone coffins, bronze shields, and the bones of horses laid standing against the walls. Moisture moved through them in slow pulses, feeding downward toward the center. Lord Vayrad sat beneath them. His throne had been cut from one block of black stone. Roots bound his arms to its rests and crossed his chest in layers, entering beneath the ribs and coming out through the back. A crown of bronze thorns pressed into the dried scalp. His mouth stood open around a wedge of iron driven between the jaws. The burial chain lay coiled at his feet, its collar open. Geralt moved closer. Veyrad's body had not decayed like the others. The skin was dark and tight, yet the hands remained thick, the nails unbroken, the shoulders broad beneath a rotted mantle sewn with bronze grain. His bare feet rested in a basin of black soil. Small white shoots grew between his toes. The bronze vessel lay inside his chest. The ribs had been split and spread around it before burial. The seed vessel resembled a husk of barley, longer than Geralt's palm, made in two fitted halves with a narrow seam along the edge, and roots wound through the opened body to hold it against the spine. The prize waited within reach. Nothing in the chamber stirred. Geralt did not touch it. He circled the throne, watching the roots rather than the corpse. On the rear of the seat, beneath dried folds of mantle, someone had carved a row of figures. A priest holding an iron wedge against a kneeling lord's mouth. A mailed jailer drawing a chain around the lord's neck. Behind them, villagers carrying a bronze seed vessel between two poles. The final figure had been damaged. Geralt cleared the dirt from it with his thumb. The lord sat enthroned beneath roots, the vessel inside his chest. From the vessel rose lines that ran through every root in the mound. At the bottom, beneath the throne, the same lines reached into fields, drawn above a cluster of houses. The summer seed had never carried a blessing. It carried the blight. Vayrod had taken the first grain from every harvest and mixed it with blood, binding the fields to his keeping. Belisar buried the vessel with him so the bond would stay sealed beneath stone. When the outer pin was pulled and the wards weakened, the vessel fed again, drawing life from the fields through roots no plow could reach. Geralt examined the seam in the bronze. Tiny letters circled it, worn but still legible. What is taken returns. What returns is owed. The Lord's nature lay in possession. Grain, blood, names, men. His white would hold whatever had been given and claim whatever touched it. Geralt drew the silver sword and cut the nearest root. Black sap welled from the wound. Veyrod's right hand closed, a small movement no more than one finger curling, but roots tightened across the throne in answer. Soil shifted in the basin beneath his feet. The iron wedge between his teeth creaked. The second root came apart under the silver, and Veyrod's head lifted. The crown tore skin from the brow as the corpse turned toward him. Kernels of black grain filled the empty sockets, rolling in the hollows, following the blade. "You opened my house," the dead lord said. Around the iron, the words came from the roots, not the mouth. Passing through the chamber, from every wall, 100 dry voices joined beneath the earth. Geralt raised the sword and told him his house was a prison. "All earth is a house," the roots answered, "to one buried deep enough." Roots uncoiled from the floor. They did not strike at once, but rose between Geralt and the throne, forming a slow cage, and along their surfaces, knots opened like mouths. Names came out of them in whispers, those carved upon the pillars above, each taken death held and repeated. Veyrod's left hand closed. The vessel pulsed inside his ribs. Pain gripped Geralt's wounded palm. Blood drew itself from the cut in thin threads and floated through the air toward the throne. He clenched the hand. The pull strengthened. Drops left the torn glove and vanished among the roots. What touched Vayrod became owed. Geralt stepped back and reached into his pouch. The strip of skin bearing Rysar lay inside. Belisar's missing name taken from the threshold and kept apart from the priest's body. He drew it out and held it toward the throne and said that Vayrod had taken this. The whispers stopped. The grain-filled eyes turned toward the strip. "Mine," the roots said. Geralt threw it into the basin. The dead lord seized it, and every root in the chamber bent toward the throne. The strip struck the black soil between Veyrod's feet. His toes closed over it. The roots abandoned Geralt's blood and plunged into the basin, fighting one another for the stolen fragment of the priest's name. Geralt moved. He crossed the chamber, cut the root, looped through Veyrod's sternum, and drove his left hand between the spread ribs. The bronze vessel was warm, almost hot. Its seam opened against his fingers with a faint click. Inside lay black grain packed in blood-dark wax. Veyrod's jaw tore free of the iron wedge. His mouth opened wider than a living skull allowed. Geralt ripped the vessel from his chest. The roots convulsed. They struck walls, throne, and floor in one violent movement, and a thick coil caught Geralt across the back and hurled him into the stone basin. Soil filled his mouth. The bronze husk stayed in his hand. Vayrod rose from the throne. Roots tore from his body and snapped back into the roof. The corpse came forward, with its ribs still spread, the empty hollow in its chest leaking black sap, bronze thorns falling from the broken crown,
grain pouring from its eye sockets. Geralt rolled aside as Veyrod's hand struck the basin and split it. He came up on one knee, drew the clay flask of lamp oil, poured it into the open vessel. The dead lord reached for him. Geralt struck flint against the silver guard, and a spark fell into the bronze husk, and flame burst blue-white around the black grain. Veyrod stopped. The fire did not spread to the roots. It stayed inside the vessel, consuming what the Lord had taken harvest after harvest. The whispers in the walls became a roar. Names poured from the root mouths and vanished upward through the mound. The corpse folded at the waist. Geralt snapped the two halves of the bronze vessel shut around the burning grain. Heat seared through his glove. He bound it with the silver cord from his pack and thrust it beneath his armor. The chamber shook. A crack raced across the roof, and earth spilled through it in a heavy stream. Roots recoiled into the walls, no longer pulsing, and coffins and horse bones collapsed into the space they had held. Veyrod lunged once more. Geralt did not meet him with the sword. He seized the burial chain and threw the open collar around the dead lord's neck. The clasp closed where the bronze pin had broken, held now only by the pull of the links, and Geralt wrapped the chain around the throne and dragged it tight. Veyrod clawed at the iron. His fingers found the scratches left there by his own living hands, and something like memory crossed the ruined face. From beyond the sealed arch came Velor's voice. "Hold!" The chain tightened. Veyrod was torn backward onto the throne, and roots burst from the black stone and drove through his arms, shoulders, and open chest, fastening him where he had sat. The dead lord thrashed once, then again, each movement smaller, as the burning vessel under Geralt's armor consumed the grain that fed him. Stone began to fall above. Geralt turned toward the arch. The roots covering it had hardened into a wall. He drew steel and cut. The first stroke lodged halfway through. The second opened a narrow split, and through it came gray vapor and the grinding of armor as Velor tore at the other side. Living blade and dead gauntlets broke the roots apart between them, and Geralt forced himself through. Velor waited on the bridge, one arm braced against the wall. Cracks ran across the middle slab. Behind the guardian, darkness breathed up from the shaft. The corpse knight looked at the bronze glow beneath Geralt's armor and said that he had it. Geralt stepped onto the bridge. "Dawn is coming." Far above, a sound moved through the barrow. Stone doors opened one after another. Velor turned toward the stair. The first pale line of cold light appeared in the visor of his helm, though no dawn could yet reach so deep. "He knows the way out," the guardian said. Behind them, Veyrod screamed through the roots. The bridge split beneath Geralt's feet. He ran. The middle slab broke behind him. Stone dropped into the shaft with Velor upon it, and the corpse knight caught one root in both hands, armor striking the wall as the broken bridge fell away beneath him. Geralt reached the far side before the last slab tilted, seized the arch, and swung himself onto the stair while darkness opened at his heels. Velor hung across the gulf. His gauntlets tore through the root by slow degrees. Gray vapor streamed from the visor. Below him, the broken slabs turned once in the dark and vanished without a sound. Geralt braced one boot against the jamb and held out his steel sword. Velor looked at the blade. "Take it." The corpse knight released one hand from the root and caught the sword below the guard. Geralt pulled. Rusted armor scraped across the wall. then struck the arch hard enough to crack the stones around them. Valor dragged himself onto the stair and returned the weapon hilt first. The mound shook again. A block dropped from the roof between them, and Valor caught it across one shoulder. The stone split against his armor and drove him to one knee. But Geralt had already turned upward. The stair no longer lay as he remembered it. Steps had lifted from their beds and leaned at different angles, forming steep ridges of broken stone. Black wax poured down between them in warm streams. Roots burst through the walls and withdrew again, probing the passage ahead like fingers searching beneath a door. Geralt climbed over the first tilted slab. Heat pressed beneath his armor where the bronze vessel rested against his ribs. The grain within went on burning, though the silver cord held both halves shut, and each pulse of flame sent pain across his chest and drew a shudder from the mound. Behind him, Valor rose, followed 3 steps, then stopped. A chain rattled far below. The sound passed through the stair and into the armor, and the guardian's helm turned toward the dark. "He calls," the corpse knight said. Geralt told him to let the dead lord call. "He has called me longer than your villages have had names," Valor said. Geralt reached the first bend. "Then make him wait." Valor pulled the broken sword from the roots where it had lodged during the struggle below. The rusted blade came free with a tearing sound, and he turned downward, filling the narrow stair with iron. One word only. "Go!" Geralt climbed. Veyrod's scream rose beneath him, no longer shaped through roots and stone. It came from a throat that had remembered pain, thick with soil and burning grain. The sound struck Valor first, and the guardian planted the broken sword across the passage. Geralt did not look back when iron met bone. The stair steepened toward the chamber of names. Blue light spilled around the upper bend, bright enough to show wet walls and black wax tracks. Voices moved inside it. Some called for help. Others spoke his name in the tones of people long dead, wearing memories found in his blood when it touched the throne. He reached the arch, and the chamber beyond had filled with pale figures. They stood between the pillars in burial shifts, mail, field cloth, children's smocks. Skull lamps hung from their hands, each burning with a cold flame that gave no heat. Faces turned toward Geralt. Dozens at first, then hundreds, where the darkness deepened behind them. Belisar's broken pillar lay at the center. The priest's bones had risen from the ash, ropes still binding the skeleton from throat to ankle, and the tongue moved inside the jaw, without flesh enough to shape the words. "Names?" Belisar said. The dead advanced. Geralt stepped into the chamber and drew the iron hook from his belt. The priest's tongue was gone from it, but the hook had pierced that divided name for centuries, and a trace remained in the rust, enough to carry command if the command was true. He struck the hook against the nearest carved pillar. Rada, a woman holding a skull lamp, stopped. Her name stood beneath Geralt's hand, cut deep into the stone. He moved to the next and said Thomas, and a mailed figure lowered its spear. Another name waited beside it. He said Ilwyn, and a child released the hand of the thing beside her. Geralt crossed the chamber, reading where the taper light had shown him the carvings before. He spoke each name he passed, giving the dead back what Veyrod had held as tally and possession. The figures faltered one by one. Skull lamps fell from their hands and broke without sound. blue flames shrinking into the stone. The nameless shapes at the rear came faster. They had no carvings left, or none he could reach in time. Their faces changed as they moved, borrowing those of the villagers above, the old man, the girl by the well, the farmer with the wrapped hand. Their mouths opened together. "Stay." Balisar lifted his bound arms. The ropes tightened around his bones until several ribs cracked, and he turned his skull toward the smooth fragments of his pillar, asking for his name. Geralt drew the strip of skin from the broken pouch at his belt. Only half remained. The rest had gone into Veyrod's basin, claimed by the roots. On the surviving scrap, the burned letters Rhizar curled black against the flesh. He crossed the chamber and pressed it into Belisar's jaw. The priest closed his teeth upon it, and the blue figures recoiled. "Belisar," Geralt said. The skeleton straightened. Ash rose around him in a narrow column, and the ropes loosened and fell from the bones as brittle cords. When Belisar spoke again, the voice came through every carved name at once. "Leave." The dead turned. They did not vanish. They faced the passages from which the false lights and borrowed voices had come, and one by one they entered the dark, carrying the last blue flames with them. The chamber dimmed until only the bronze glow beneath Geralt's armor remained. Belisar's skull tilted toward the upper passage. "Dawn moves," he said, and when Geralt asked how long, the answer came flat. Less than a prayer, more than a breath. The priest's bones began to settle. Geralt caught the iron hook as it fell from the open jaw and asked whether the priest could hold the way. Belisar looked toward the third passage. Below, Valor's broken sword struck stone. Once, twice. The third blow ended in the crash of armor. "I can hold his name," the priest said. "The weight belongs to you." Geralt ran. Water met him at the lower edge of the flooded shaft. It no longer drained downward. The current had reversed and climbed the stair in hard surges, carrying bones, broken coffin wood, strands of dead black hair. The chamber above had filled to the roof. Each pulse forced more water through the narrow opening, raising the level around his thighs. The grave thing had come apart, but pieces of its binding remained. Hair coiled around his boot. He cut it with silver and climbed into the current, and the water struck his chest. Another surge lifted him from the steps and slammed his shoulder against the wall. The bronze vessel burned hotter beneath his armor, hissing where the flood reached it. Geralt pulled the last vial from his belt. The liquid inside was dark and thick. Swallow would close torn flesh and keep his failing strength from leaving all at once, but it would also sharpen the fire already moving through his blood. He drank. Bitterness struck first, then heat. His heart beat hard enough to hurt. The cold water no longer dulled his limbs, though every wound announced itself at once. The cut palm, the bruised throat, the torn calf, the shoulder struck against stone. He climbed through them all, hand over hand, along the stair rail. A coffin lid swept down from above. Geralt ducked beneath it, and the wood struck the wall and split, releasing a body wrapped in reeds. Water spun the corpse toward him. Its bronze neck loop had opened, but white roots still filled the ribs. The body seized the rail. Geralt stepped on its shoulder, used it as a brace, and climbed past while the current tore it away. The opening to the upper chamber had narrowed. Roots had grown across it again, pale and swollen from the flood. Geralt drew steel and hacked once. The blade caught. A second stroke split the thickest strand, but the broken ends twisted together before he could force through. He shoved the bronze vessel against them. Heat passed through his armor and into the roots, and they blackened at once. The growth shrank from the burning grain, opening a hole no wider than his chest. Geralt pushed his head and one shoulder through, while water hammered his legs. Roots tightened around the scabbards on his back. He tore free, losing the steel sword as the weapon snagged and vanished into the flood below. He entered the hall of the kneeling dead with only silver. The chamber had changed. The benches had collapsed, and corpses and grain covered the floor beneath ankle-deep water. Belishar's pillar had split completely, leaving the stair unsupported at its center. The whole shaft leaned toward one side, stones grinding as the mound settled around the empty grave. The entrance passage waited above. Between Geralt and the stair stood the mallet-bearer, its head hung by a strip of dried flesh. Both bronze bands had split, yet black grain packed its chest where ribs should have been, roots drawing the kernels together into the shape of a heart. The corpse lifted the wooden mallet. 3 pale marks showed on the bench behind it. The knocks had never been a summons from below. They were a count. The mallet fell. Geralt cast Írden across the flooded floor. The violet line spread through water and ash, slow but broad, catching the corpse as it stepped from the bench. The sign did not bind flesh. It caught the command, driving the grain within it. The mallet stopped a hand's breadth above Geralt's skull. Black kernels pushed through the corpse's chest, straining toward him. Írden flared brighter. The root heart slowed. Each pulse dragged long enough for Geralt to see the binding tighten and release. He drove the silver sword through the grain, and the blade entered without striking bone. The root heart split around it. Kernels poured into the water and drifted across the violet lines, where each one smoked and burst. The corpse folded over Geralt's shoulder. He threw it aside and pulled the sword free. The central stair gave way. Stone collapsed into the chamber, crushing benches and dead beneath a wave of dust. Geralt ran up the outer edge as steps fell behind him. The shaft narrowed. The roof struck his sword hilts and forced him lower. Ahead, no torchlight showed. Only a thin gray line crossed the top of the passage. Dawn. The entrance slab had begun to close from within. The gap stood no higher than his knee, sealed by the iron pin and the dried knot of sinew around it. Stone ground downward, shaving sparks from the point. Geralt dropped beside the pin, wrapped both hands around it, and pulled. The iron did not move. Behind him, the stair chamber came down with a roar, and dust and cold air drove up the passage. Something came with them, dragging chain over stone. Vayrod had left the throne. Geralt planted both boots on the wall and pulled again. The wound in his palm split open. Blood ran over the silver winding at the pin's head, and beneath it the old burial command darkened. Remain, bind, remember. The bronze vessel burned against his ribs. He tore it free, snapped the silver cord, opened the husk. Blue-white fire rose off the black grain. He poured it over the pin. The sinew caught first. Flame raced through the dried knot inside the wall and showed him what was in there: bone, cord, and an iron point driven through a human wrist entombed behind the stone. The outer ward had been fastened with part of Belisar's body. Geralt seized the burning pin and spoke the priest's name once. The wrist opened. Iron slid free. The entrance slab lurched up by the width of a hand. Gray light poured in beneath it, cold and clean, and touched his face. A chain struck his ankle. He fell hard. Veyrod filled the passage behind him, bent under the low roof, roots and broken stone hanging off his shoulders. Valor's collar was still around his neck, and the corpse knight's severed hand clung to the chain near the clasp. The dead lord pulled. Geralt slid backward through dust and burning grain, rolled onto his back and cast Igni into the open bronze vessel. The last black kernels flared. Veyrod stopped as fire ran through every root still buried in his body, light opening beneath the dead skin. The grasp loosened. The chain stayed around Geralt's ankle. Outside, someone shouted his name. The slab began to fall. Geralt cut the chain with silver. The first stroke scarred one link. The second split it. He kicked free, thrust the bronze vessel beneath the descending stone, and crawled toward the gray light, while metal crushed between rock and threshold. The husk held for one breath. Its seam buckled. Geralt pulled himself out. The vessel broke behind him. The slab crashed shut. Earth jumped across the field. The barrow's crown sank around the split rowan. Every thorn on its slope bent flat, and a deep sound rolled beneath the turf and faded away east. Geralt lay in the dead furrow, breathing soil and morning air. The old man and 3 villagers stood several paces off. None of them came closer until he pushed himself onto one elbow and opened his hand. Half the bronze vessel was still in his grip. Inside it, under ash and melted silver, lay one pale seed. First light touched the mound. Nothing knocked from below.